Week 10 out of 13. We're getting toward the end here. And I've chosen to title this week's session A Clash of Authorities because last week we finished off where Jesus had entered into the stronghold of the Jewish authorities, into Jerusalem, and had immediately begun doing things that clashed with them even more so than he had been. And his disciples must have gotten a front row seat to this challenge between the existing religious authorities and Jesus. Because all this time, if you recall, one of the main points of awe about him is how he speaks and he acts with authority, not like the teachers of the law do. And so they're sitting there watching a debate over many individual points of righteousness, but there's this larger question looming over it all. Who has the right to speak for God before the people? And it might seem odd having this strange interlude on his way back to the city, where it says, he became hungry, Jesus did. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. Of course, you look at the different gospel accounts of this moment. There's another story that says they went on their way, and when they came back, it had already withered. But if you remember, I mean, if you've ever dealt with plants, you know that you uproot a plant and it doesn't wither in that moment, but it begins to wither immediately. And he hasn't uprooted it, he's just spoken to it. And of course, when they noticed this, his disciples marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? And Jesus answered them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. The very great danger of this vignette is to lift it out of its context. Right? Because some people do. They take this and they say, well, if you only had enough faith, basically what they're saying is everything will go your way. But think about this. As I've pointed out before in other instances, a fig tree in the Bible is rarely ever just a fig tree. Usually it represents something. And here we have one that has the signs of fruit, right? The full leaf was an indicator that it was going to start bearing fruit very soon. But there were no signs of fruit on this tree. The reality had not followed that initial sign. So rather than this being, as some people would have it, Jesus in a fit of temper destroying something because it didn't give him what he wanted, and then telling his disciples that you could do the same thing too if you had enough faith. Think about this as the authority of faith. This is a living parable. A fig tree that shows signs of fruit without the reality of fruit. Well, we'll come to that pretty quickly. It's a figure of Israel at this time, especially the leadership. And when Jesus says, whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. Think about this in the same frame as Hebrews chapter 4, where the writer says, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. There is an authority that faith reaches out to, in not its own, like our authority, but the authority of the confidence that we can have that God will grant prayer, that he hears, and he is already working. So opening the day with this incident, then, when they arrive at the temple, it's probably still fairly early in the morning, but they are ready for him. They are lying in wait, the chief priests and the elders of the people. And as he starts to teach, they come up and they challenge him. By what authority are you doing these things? And you have to remember, they're not just talking about sitting down and teaching in the temple. They're still sore about the day before, when Jesus cleared out the money changers and the livestock sellers, whom the chief priests and the elders had given permission to be there. So they want to know, whose authority are you borrowing from to challenge our authority? Who says you can overrule us? And Jesus answered them, I also will ask you one question. And if you can answer me that, then I'll answer you. By what authority I do these things? Baptism of John. Where did it come from? From heaven or from man? And they, of course, break into a huddle. But the sad thing is that it's a huddle in search of a dishonest answer. They're not looking to find the true answer of it, but only the most advantageous reply. And you can hear it in their words. If we say it's from heaven, well, then he'll say, why didn't you believe him? Right? That would be admitting that we were wrong. That's not good. But if we say from man, that's a problem, because the crowd's listening and we're a little scared of them. They think he was a prophet. So they turn and with a united front come to Jesus and say, we don't know. And so he says, well, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Well, we have a moment here that displays quite clearly what sort of leadership the faithful in Israel have to suffer under, who are not concerned about whether something is true from heaven, from God, but rather whether it is to their advantage or not. And so Jesus tells 3 parables of what I consider escalating rejection, right? He begins with the parable of the 2 sons. Very straightforward story. A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, son, go and work in the vineyard today. And he answered, I will not. But afterward, he changed his mind and he went. And went to the other son, and he said the same. And he said, I go, sir. But he didn't go. Which of the 2 did the will of the Father? And he said, well, the first one. You have to remember, neither of these 2 sons is admirable. But, right, the apparently disobedient one ends up obeying, while the other one disobeys despite a pretense of obedience. And so Jesus explains this parable very clearly. Truly, I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw that, you did not afterwards change your minds and believe him. So here we have their rejection of John, displaying quite publicly their disobedience to God. Just as these sinners, in accepting John, shows their obedience. Neither side, of course, being wholly admirable, but one side obeys in humility, and the other side, despite a pretense of obedience to God, refuse. All right, so here we have rejection of John the Baptist. Let's step out and take a broader view of this even so. Parable of the tenants. Nasty, greedy tenants. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a wine press in it, built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. He came looking for fruit. What did he find? The tenants took his servants, beat one, killed another, stoned another, and again he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance. And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? And they said to him, he'll put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their season. Other Gospels are much clearer in that this is the crowd answering, not the Pharisees. And Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. So here we come back to the idea of showing signs of fruit, but not producing any. Only in this case, you have hoarding the fruits of righteousness, coveting ownership, control of the kingdom of God. They have not just rejected John, but all of God's prophets have been rejected. You can flash forward here to these woes that we'll get to in chapter 23 that Jesus pronounces against them. Keep your finger in this parable for when we get to chapter 23. So we've stepped out and we've looked at a broader picture, but he's not finished yet, because though he did not emphasize this in the parable of the tenants, he will here in the parable of the wedding feast. Because you remember, the messengers that were killed, the son that was killed, they were all sent by someone. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went off, each one to his own business, one to his farm, another to business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry. He sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. And then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. The king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. So we've now come to the broadest perspective of this idea of fruitlessness and of rejection. They rejected John, but that was not unusual because they had rejected all the prophets up to that point. And in rejecting these messengers, they have rejected the one who sent them. They have declared themselves and their own interests as more important than their God. And they never would have thought that because they thought, well, our interests are his interests. We like to get that mixed up. It's a very human thing to do. But it's the other way around. His interests must be our interests. But no, you notice in the parable, it's like, well, some of them just ignored him and went off about their own business, looking after their own interests. But you don't do that to a king. We don't have this really in our culture anymore, but absolute monarchy is a dangerous thing to ignore. Just as dangerous to ignore as it is to rebel openly by mistreating and killing his servants. But do you also hear in here the determination that God has to bring his people to his table? He makes repeated attempts to the first invitees, and then after they are declared unworthy, there's this sweeping and indiscriminate welcome. Did you hear that? The good and the bad were brought in. But obedience is still required, even in that sense. Because the guests were to be wearing the festive garments that they had been given. And the one who decided, whatever, my own is good enough. We find out it isn't. And this reminded me very strongly of Romans 11. Where Paul is talking about how the Gentiles got grafted in after the natural people of God, Israel, had been broken off. And he tells them, if you say branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in, well, that's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what was by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? It may be that some think, well, he called me, so he must want me here. But obedience was the point on which the original guests faltered. Whether it was the disobedience of merely ignoring him or of rebelling openly against him. So too with those who have been called afterward. So here we have this sequence of parables, these escalating rejections, with a warning in it for those of us who come after. And they stop, and his enemies decide, well, let's try to trip him up through what he says. So we have 3 tests that they put to him. The first one, the disciples of the Pharisees and some Herodians, they come to him and they say, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you're not swayed by appearances. Could you lay it on any thicker than that? But not thickly enough to conceal the malice that lies beneath it. When they say, 'Tell us what you think. Is it lawful to pay Caesar's taxes or not?'" Now, taxes will always get a reaction from people. And in this case, they're thinking, well, if he's popular with the people and he says to stay popular with them, no, it's unlawful. Then we've got him on the Roman side, because anyone who says it's not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, well, you know how the Romans think about that. But if he goes to the other side and says, "Oh, yes, you must obey Rome," then he's going to lose popularity, because no one wants to pay any taxes to Rome. But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And he said, "Well, whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." So basically, the principle is pay to each one what is owed them. You give taxes to your government so that they function. What do you give to God? What is owed to him? And of course, this fails. He passes the test. He doesn't give them the answer they expect, any answer that they might have expected. So, round 2, new group, the Sadducees, who say that there is no resurrection, come and ask him a question about the resurrection. "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married, died, and having no children, left his wife to his brother. So too the second, and the third down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her as wife." This is one of those silly questions that people tend to like to debate because, for one thing, there's no real point to it. And so it doesn't really matter what you say about it. But Jesus thinks differently. He goes to the root of their error, which springs from, as he says, "You know neither the scriptures nor the power of God." So he's addressing their misconceptions first of what the resurrection is. And here he says, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. My Greek teacher from Ozark, I once was hearing him give a presentation on this passage. He's talking about heaven, right? And rather tongue in cheek, he says, I think of it this way. In heaven, I won't be married to my wife, exclusively in the same way we've been. I'll just have equal access to everyone else's wives. And knowing that he was, of course, joking, his colleagues all just howled with laughter because they're like, oh, you. But he says, the resurrection is going to be so fundamentally different from what we know here that you're starting from the wrong basis to begin with. And as for the fact of its existence, this resurrection of the dead, which you say couldn't possibly be, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He's not God of the dead, but of the living. And the crowd heard this and they were astonished at his teaching. Nobody had ever addressed these Sadducees in that very way. So round 2 fails. And of course, the Pharisees, having recuperated from their previous defeat, they gathered together and they put forward one of their own, a lawyer, who asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Well, that sounds like a really important question. Like, what's the most important? What's the one you absolutely have to get right, no matter what else? But rather than follow their train of thought, Jesus answers, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. And this is the great and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Because on these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Hard to argue with that one. They are the broadest, as well as the most difficult to consistently follow through on. If you were to say, don't covet, well, okay. That would probably be doable if you put all of your focus, all your energy into making sure to root out every covetous thought. But why? Why don't you covet? Same thing for not giving false witness, not lying, or not committing adultery. There's a reason behind it, right? And of course, if you go back to the Old Testament, Joseph is a good example of this when he was debating with Potiphar's wife, and he said, I can't do this and sin against God and your husband. And that's where you come back to, why don't you do all these other things? Out of love, wholehearted, whole person love for the Lord your God. And the only way you can love your neighbor is with the love of God. Because not all your neighbors are that lovable. And I'm sure our neighbors think the same thing of us sometimes. But with the love that God gives to those who love him, it's possible. So probably after this 3rd failure to trip him up, they're maybe in their huddle again. You don't know. We're not told. It just said that they were gathered together. And Jesus asked them a question. What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said to him, Son of David, of course. And he said to them, How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And they couldn't answer him. In fact, it says from that day, no one dared to ask him any more questions. He has this unsettling habit of turning around and asking you unanswerable questions. And now, yeah, this section of Matthew makes me think that sometimes the best example is a really bad example. Something that shows everything you shouldn't do and shows why. So Jesus then turns to the crowds and his disciples, and he gets really, really uncomfortable with them. You know, he's just like full on, really blunt things that you normally wouldn't say out loud. At least, certainly not publicly and in the presence of the people you're talking about. But in the face of the crowds, the disciples, and witnesses that will tell, if not the Pharisees and their scribes themselves, he says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with a finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher. You're all brothers. Call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. Pause a moment here. The words themselves are not the issue. Taken within their context, this is a warning about wanting to seem important. Rather a necessary warning for his disciples. Because if you remember from last week, even at this point, they were still having these quarrels over which one of them was the most important. And to be honest, here we have an example of people whose sole purpose in life seemed to be to want to be important. Wanting the place of honor at the feast, the best seat in the synagogue, to be greeted at the marketplace by titles of honor. Rabbi, my father, teacher. And Jesus is saying, among you, this isn't to happen. Because you are all equally brothers under one God, one Lord, one Spirit. The greatest among you must be your servant. I think we've heard this before. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So you have first the warnings. Don't become like these self-important people. Warnings against hypocrisy. expecting more of others than you do of yourself. Warnings against, of course, the self-importance, the lording it over others we talked about last week. But that's not enough, because now it's time to speak directly to these self-important, hypocritical authorities. In a direct clash, he declares 7 woes against Israel's religious authorities. The first one: woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Rather sort of a dog in the manger. This, again, reminds me very much of that, well, John's baptism. From heaven or from man? They didn't want to, they didn't believe it was from heaven, because then they would have to repent. They would have to humble themselves. Of course, they're not going to do that. But then they also didn't want anybody else doing it because, no. We're in charge here. We're in control. And you do what we tell you to do. So the first woe is not only refusing the kingdom of God, but obstructing others from entering it. The second woe: woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Related, but slightly different. They go to great lengths to bring people under their authority, and then to insist upon them. Well, and again, here's that, tie up with heavy burdens, hard to bear, burdens they themselves aren't willing to carry. Woe to you, blind guides, who say if anyone swears by the temple, it's nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by that oath. It's like, way to reveal your true motives. You swear oaths and you uphold them that value the lesser over the greater. Your own skewed priorities have crept in. What is it that makes the gold in the temple sacred? If anyone swears by the altar, it's nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that's on the altar, he's bound by his oath. These are their traditions. These are the things they're teaching people. Which is greater, though? The gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? You have to keep your priorities in order, and these people have not done so. The fourth woe: you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. They have neglected the heart of the law in favor of its externals. These are the people who are plotting to kill him. A direct violation of one of the main 10 commandments, and yet they considered themselves justified because he's been breaking our traditions left and right, and he's threatening our authority. They've neglected the true core of the law while maintaining scrupulously its externals. So fifth woe flows very closely out of that. You clean the outside of the cup and plate, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, the outside may also be clean. So not only are they neglecting the heart of the law, but they're neglecting the corruption in their own hearts, and only giving an outward appearance of purity. Variations on a theme, part 2. You're like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. That corruption of their hearts is turned to death, spiritual death, this lawlessness, while on the outside they have this rigid appearance of obedience to the law. And of course, the seventh woe brings us right back to where we started. You build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you'll kill and crucify, some you'll flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. And the sort of reverse benediction at the end of this sermon, if you will, is a lament over Jerusalem as a whole, the city that kills the prophets and stones those sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you would not. Your house has left you desolate. You will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Because no group ever goes beyond its leadership. And if these are its leaders, self-important, shutting the door of the kingdom in people's faces, burdening people, skewing priorities, neglecting the law in favor of their own traditions, then what hope has the city, the country, under their guidance? So that's a really sour note to end on, isn't it? But you have to remember, this clash of authorities isn't resolved through words, but through actions. Next week, we go into the first half of the last discourse. We're just going to focus on chapter 24. There's a lot in it and a lot to talk about. So yeah, focus for your readings for this week on chapter 24.